So if you're a founder, a piece of advice, or you plan to be a founder, is like spend a lot of time investing in your network. Just go to events, talk to people, help people with their products, give as much free advice as possible. And then when it's time for you to like be up to bat, like people will line up around you and help out.
I think it would be helpful to get some context on Paragon. Give us like the elevator pitch.
Yeah.
What do you guys do?
Cool. So as Jake mentioned, my name is Ishmael. I'm co-founder and CTO of Paragon. Paragon's a low-code embedded integration platform. That's like the TLDR. What that means is, our thesis is that every software company today has to integrate with a ton of different applications. Your customers expect to integrate with like their Slack or their Salesforce or their marketing or whatever CRM. But to build those integrations takes often like months of development, which is away from their core value prop. But when you're doing enterprise sales, like you're selling to other SaaS companies, the expectation is that you have all these different integrations. And so we sell to enterprise SaaS companies. So they're SaaS that's selling to other SaaS, and they connect to us once and they get access to our entire integration catalog. So if you are a messaging platform and you want to connect to your customer Slacks, you want to connect to their Salesforce, Asana, blah, 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 connect to us.
Awesome. And I know you've were pretty recently raised some money with you and your co-founder, and kind of tell us where are you at in terms of scale? I mean, how many employees do you have? Kind of what have you raised, the most recently?
Yeah. So we've been operating for about 3 years now. We founded the company August 2019, me and my co-founder. We've raised about $17 million to date. Our last round was our Series A that we announced at 13, led by Inspired Capital. Per stage, we found product market fit probably early this year, like late last year. And so essentially found like a sweet spot where we had a very difficult problem to solve. There weren't a lot of competitors in it, and our customers were willing to pay like very high ticket prices for this. And we crossed like the 7-figure ARR mark. So that's what triggered our Series A. Per like volume, we're doing like the hundreds of millions of events per month. We've been growing pretty consistently between like 10 and 40% like month on month for the last like maybe like 15 months, which drove also like our Series A. Still like a smallish team for Series A. Like typically you'd expect to be about maybe 40, 45 people. But we've scaled it down just given the market environment to extend our runway. And we expect to probably be at 40, 45 people by mid next year.
Congrats. It's incredible. So I want to rewind, kind of go back to maybe even your childhood, kind of what really led you towards technology or kind of like drew you into that? Because I know when we had talked, you kind of wanted to be a founder from a pretty young age, or knew that you wanted to be one.
Yeah, I think for me, technology represented a lot of things. One, I wanted to be able to work from wherever. So when I was 17, I spent a little bit of time thinking about how I wanted my life to look like. I'd spent quite a bit of time traveling, just like hitchhiking and like hopping on trains and such around the country, and got to see all different types of lifestyles. I did tons of different jobs, from working at restaurants to playing music to lessons, all these things. And when I spent a little bit of time thinking about what I wanted my life to look like. And so one, I knew I wanted to be a founder. Two, I had been working like minimum wage jobs, and I knew very early like there couldn't be a relationship between my income and my time. And so I was like, what are the ways I can do that? And technology was very aligned with that. I wanted to be able to like work from wherever because I wanted to continue to travel, and I didn't have startup capital, and so I needed something that I could build myself or teach myself to do without having to hire employees. And so I wrote all these things down, and when I thought about it all, being a tech founder is what I decided was like most aligned with what I wanted to do.
So how did you go about, I mean, teaching yourself how to code? Did you find resources online? Was there, local resources or places that you could go to find that info?
Yeah. So I started with a website called Linda, and they were bought by LinkedIn a few years ago for like $1 billion. You could get a subscription for like $15 a month and get courses on everything from software to, let's say, like Excel to like marketing to sales. And I got a subscription. I just started watching a ton of videos on HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Did that for like a few months. Maybe after 2-3 months, I knew enough to start building my own website ideas. And I started putting together ideas maybe 3 months in. And I did that for probably the first 3 years, where I was constantly watching videos and like working on ideas on the side. And then at the probably 4 to 6 month mark, I got good enough that I could start freelancing. And so I started freelancing, and that provided like my living while I continued to learn and put out ideas on the side.
Awesome. Do you remember like one of your first ideas or the first thing you might have tried to build?
Oh yeah, it's awful. So my first idea was in 2012. It's called Jailbreak Mecca, jailbreakmecca.com. It's not around anymore. But at the time, jailbreaking your iPhone was like the hot thing to do. And so I found all of the different cracks and just had the downloads and put them in one website. And then you could download the cracks, and I had instructions on how to do it on your phone. And I put ads on it. And so it took me, I think it took me like 6 weeks to build, and I made like 3 cents on advertising. And so I was like, all right, this sucks. And so I went on to the next one.
That's awesome. So that had to have evolved. I mean, obviously you started doing some freelancing, and that must have taught you quite a bit about just working with clients, working with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of tell us about that experience. Well, in your first experiences in freelancing, what are some of the big lessons that you might have learned that you're taking with you now?
Yeah. I think through freelancing, one of the lessons that I learned is that there's a clear difference between a product and a company. And I built several products, but many of them couldn't be monetized, and there was like no clear way to monetize those things. And people were so focused, even myself, on several of those. I was so focused on like the technology and like the use case, but like I wasn't thinking about, or my clients too, like they weren't thinking about the solution from like the customer's perspective, and how to turn this thing into a machine that gets more users and builds a community around it and builds a sustainable business model. And so there's a very clear difference between a product and a company, and like learning the nuances of that, and that's like its own talk. I'd say it's similar to the first, but a more focused one is that most people build solutions in search of a problem, right? As opposed to trying to find problems to build solutions for. And if you do it in the wrong order, you'll end up building something that no one wants, because like you're so fixated on your particular way of doing something. And so many of the customers, almost all of them that I built products for the first few years, they didn't talk to anyone. They didn't do any customer development. They didn't do any market research. They were just like, here's how I'm going to do this thing. And then they dropped like $50,000 or $100,000 doing it. And then it got released, and then no one used it. And they're like, damn, that's like not how you build a product. Just don't do that. The way that you should do it is talk to a lot of people, understand their use cases, like build a thesis, treat it like the scientific method. And there's like tons of books on this, from like the Lean Startup to the Mom Test. But yeah, just treating it like a science experiment and spending the least amount of money and time to validate ideas before investing large amounts of resources into them.
Interesting. So how do you go about, kind of implementing that knowledge where you have an idea, you want to go out and try to execute, and hopefully you found a problem, not just a solution. How do you go about evaluating the concept itself? Is it even a good idea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So taking a step back, I think most people think that the ideas are what's valuable, but ideas are a dime a dozen. And it's all about the execution. Like if you went back, 20, 30 years and told 1,000 people about Uber or Airbnb or Bitcoin or any of these things, like none of them guaranteed, except the original founders, would have built the company or the product to be where it was or is today. And so, don't get hung up on the exact ideas or keeping it a secret. If anything, like what you should be doing is take this idea, assume everyone's going to steal it, but know that if you're to succeed, you have to do it 1,000 times better than anyone else. And so in that, before building the product, you have to go out and you have to validate the thesis and be willing to pivot 100 times. I think the best book, the best resource on this first step is called The Mom Test. And I've recommended this tons of times to my friends. The thesis on the mom test is that if you go to your mom and you're like, hey mom, I'm working on this thing, what do you think about it? She's always going to be like, you're doing great, sweetie, I love it. And it doesn't matter like what you tell her, she's going to like support you. In reality, most people are like that, and they're going to be yes men and be like, hey, like this thing is great. What you need to do is find a way where you can get actionable feedback, and that's by focusing on people's behaviors as opposed to trying to get feedback on like your particular thing. And so if you have an idea, go out and try and understand people's behaviors, and not going to get into like the solutions of that book, but figure out who has this problem, what they've done to try and solve it, what are the alternatives, how much money and time have they spent trying to solve this, who is this person that's trying to solve that thing, where can you find more of them, etc. And like building like a customer profile around that, and then iterating around like your thesis around that until you get an idea of what a good MVP, minimally viable product would look like. And then from there, building that smallest thing, to validate the idea, and then going off of that.
That's awesome. It's very funny that you said that, because I'm working on a concept in Web3. Mm-hmm. So naturally, yesterday during my family's Thanksgiving, I brought up Web3, and they're like, that's horrible, you're going to steal all of our money. And it's like it did not pass the family test. My mom, of course, she was super supportive. Yeah, but how did you go about, for Paragon specifically, going out and really validate, kind of getting that customer fit, or kind of validating that there definitely was a problem for that space specifically?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the thing that we built today is not what we originally raised money on, and it's because we did customer development and we realized we would have failed before. So do customer development. Our original thesis was, you can think of it like a Firebase competitor, right? If you're familiar with Firebase, it's like a low-code database that is easy to ship and blah, blah, blah. And so we're like, oh, well, everyone needs to put their data somewhere, and it's really hard to build products, around this stuff, and blah, blah. I forgot our exact thing at the time. And so imagine, our original product is like this database, and so we start talking to agency founders, people who are evaluating new startup ideas, people who are early in their startup cycle, and asking questions about how they arrived at their tool sets, what types of problems they're trying to solve, etc. And while we validated a number of the ideas, there were a lot of problems that came up, in that the primary one was the graduation problem, where if you get big enough, you end up building a lot of tools yourself, right? And so how can you have like a product that scales price wise, right, with like big clients, and how can you sell to like enterprise customers and not worry about them leaving your platform after they hit a certain size. Then two, the biggest problem was we had such a small window with that original product in which we could find customers. We had to essentially find them at the beginning of their product development cycle because they needed to put their data somewhere, and if they were already putting it in a database, then they'd be like, hey, sorry, we won't use you. And so that second problem of that small window in which we could catch people was enough for us to not start building the product because that limited our customer base way too much. And so we're like, what if we could catch? Well, given that that's the biggest problem, what's the opposite of that, right? How do we catch everyone at any point in their product development cycle? And the solution to that was to connect to their existing tools. And so Paragon lets you connect to any tool that you're using, any API, any database, etc. And it doesn't matter if you're just starting or you're 10 years in. You can drop it and connect immediately. And that's how we arrived at that. And we wouldn't have done that without those initial interviews.
That's amazing. Did you always have a co-founder? I mean, from the very beginning?
Yeah, from the very beginning. Brandon Foos, he's one of my best friends. We've known each other for 10 years, and I'm of the opinion that your co-founder is much more important than what you work on. I went to him. I had a Rolodex of 200 people. It was probably like 180 that I kept track of. They were the top 200 people I believe that I could start a company with. And this also included early hires like engineers, marketers, etc. Now I'd constantly rank them. And my commitment to myself was if anyone in the top 10 ever became available, I would drop what I'm doing immediately. If I was at a company, I'd quit. Just no matter what, I'd move mountains to work with those top 10. And my co-founder had been number one for several years. And so I was on his investor newsletter, and he announced that he was leaving his company. Sent him an email 5 minutes later and was like, hey, let's get lunch. And so I gave him a list of 100 ideas that I'd been thinking about. And I was like, we could work on any one of them and we will be successful. And so he's like, cool. And so we talked about it over the course of the summer, and we arrived at our initial idea, raised like $1 million on that, did customer development, pivoted to what we're doing now. But yeah, so we had a prior working relationship, and I knew from working with him then, and then working with like 50 other founders, and like after that, doing agency and consulting work, that he was cream of the crop. And I was like, this is the person I want to work with.
That's awesome. Would you always suggest, choosing somebody that's really close? I mean, you mentioned he's essentially your best friend at this point. I've heard in certain situations, choosing co-founders that are super close to you can put a lot of strain on that relationship. Would you, looking back, would you do it all over again?
Totally.
Exact same.
100%. Yeah. I think it's different from person to person. It's different from person to person for when you're choosing a co-founder, it's a lot like marriage, and you have to know that you can work with this person for the next couple decades. Right? Like at minimum, ask yourself, can you work with this person for like the next 10 years? And he has the traits that I need in in a working relationship, where we can discuss like very difficult concepts without arguing, without getting emotional. We can just look at things like factually, be like, all right, cool, this is the plan, going in this direction. We have very complementary but like not competitive skill sets. So I can like focus on the tech, and he can focus on the go-to-market. It's our business relationship works very, very, very well. And I think for other people, like you have to consider like what you're looking for, right? Like I'm probably like not an ideal co-founder for many of the people here, because of like my intensity and like my level of expectations, like, and that's okay, right? Some people need someone who's like a little bit more compassionate, right? Or a little bit more high energy, right? You have to find that for you.
Is he, as Brandon, is he more of a marketing person, more of a business person? Is he technical, same as you?
Yeah. So we ran an agency before,
Okay.
and during that time, he was writing iOS apps, and so he knows how to code. He's a great designer. He actually designed most of what Paragon is today, which is a really big feat considering how technical the product is. So he's a great like UI UX designer. He's an engineer. He hasn't written a single line of code for Paragon, and that's by design. But he understands the product very, very well. Where he is in the business, at the start, he was focused on sales, and we would do initial sales calls together, and then he would iterate on the designs while I would work on the engineering. At some point, it didn't make sense for us to be in the same meetings or doing the same things, and he started focusing on go-to-market. Now the sales and marketing teams report to him, whereas the engineering and product teams report to me.
Awesome. So I kind of want to shift gears here just a little bit and go back. So you've raised some pretty significant funding for Paragon, and I know there's somewhat of a dichotomy. There's, when you're starting a company, a ton of people, probably 50% of the people out there would say, bootstrap it all the way, don't raise any funding, you don't want to be beholden to all these people. And then the other 50%, probably all venture capitalists, say, go and raise money, we want you to, build and scale as fast as you can.
Yeah.
I won't ask you what boat that you're in, but how do you determine, based on the idea or, kind of the trajectory for the business, how do you choose which path to go down? Or is it person by person?
Yeah. This is an interesting one. Should you raise money? So, one, most people shouldn't raise money. And that's because the model of venture capital. So, venture capitalists only make money in a liquidation event, right? And that's either your company goes public or you get acquired. And most VCs investments fail, like 9 out of 10 at least fail, right? And so of the ones that make it, they need you to make a 10, 100, say 100 to 1,000x return. So if they invest at like a 20 million cap, they need you to come back at like 2 billion, right? Or 20 billion, right? And so every business that they invest in, and the inverse of that, you as a founder, if you're raising venture capital, needs to be a moonshot, meaning you expect this to go public. You expect it to be worth billions of dollars, someday. And so that takes out a lot of companies because of their business models, because of the total addressable market, and that there's nuances where you can take a non-venture business to a venture business. Like if you're a dentist and you have like a dentist office, right? Like, and you want to make that like a franchise, that's not like a venture capital business because like theoretically you could make that billions of dollars, but it's probably going to be like in the millions, like at most. And that's not venture capital territory at all. Now if you like enabled it with like tech and like you sold it to like other dentist offices and blah blah, like maybe, but that's like the primary thing. Like, are you talking in the billions, not millions, and not tens of millions or hundreds of millions, but like billions. Then typically venture capital is like winner take all, and so do you expect to become number one in the market, right? Not just like, oh, if we get like 5% of like the market share, which is like how people typically pitch their things, but like no, like we will dominate this thing and own all this. Like, is that your plan? And do you expect to run a business like that? Do you expect to be that competitive? If not, if your business isn't that big, if you don't want to compete at that scale, and if you don't want to grow at the expected rates, this is like the probably third and most important thing. Not most important thing, but like also up there. Venture capital, you have to grow at tremendous rates. We're expected to grow like at minimum like 10% month on month, which is pretty hard, right? Like if you're say at 100,000 ARR, you have to add $10,000 in new revenue. When you're at $1 million, you have to add 100,000 that month, right? When you're at 10 million, you have to add $1 million, that month in like new revenue. It gets harder and harder over time, and so not only do you have to, sell, but you have to build new functions and new teams to be able to support those motions, and consistently it just constantly gets harder. And then you have to be injecting new capital, like raising more money, and it's like this constant cycle. And so you have to commit to this really long fucking race for years and years and years, and it's constant. It's not going to get any easier. If you don't want any of those things, if it's not a hell yes for all of those, like, don't raise money.
That's a really interesting take. So essentially, all or nothing.
It's all or nothing.
Either you're all in, and I imagine as a founder, majority or half, at least half of your job is going out and raising capital, selling the idea to investors.
So this is another thing, where you want to be as a founder. In my last business, I raised a little bit of money, and it's annoying. And managing investors is like, it's a pain. There's all this stuff, and I realized as the CTO, I get all the executive benefits without a lot of the administrative issues. And granted, since it's a technical product, right, generally everything falls on me. And so I'm taking meetings like late at night and all this stuff. I'm managing like scale and there's just a lot of different issues that I have to deal with. But as a CTO and not the CEO, a lot of the administrative, financial reporting, compliance, I don't have to deal with. And so you can still be a founder and get that experience. And I've had this talk with a lot of people, like, do you want to be a CEO or do you want to be an executive? And I, at this point in my life, don't want to be a CEO. I want to be a CTO or COO.
Interesting. So that goes back to Brandon not writing any code for the business by design.
Totally.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I want to open it up for questions. I'm sure there's some people out there that have some sort of question for you.
This is a softball. Just getting small business questions. How was New Delhi?
New Delhi was fun. It's interesting. It's my first time in India. Two of my engineers got married. Two separate weddings, coincidentally on the same day. And so I had to attend two weddings. I think it's one thing that caught me off guard is how homogenous it is. I didn't see any non-Indians while I was there. Actually, that's a lie. Within the hotel, I saw people from France and Amsterdam, South America, wherever. But within the city, it was just incredibly homogenous. And so being like a foreigner, the way that they see you and view you and treat you is like, it's different. But it was a good experience.
When you're building a startup, you have many different scalability problems. Some things are easier to scale, other things are harder. What was the hardest thing for you to scale, and how did you solve that problem?
The hardest thing for me to scale is myself. As a founder, specifically a technical founder, working on a technical product, I built most of the original product myself, and it's really hard to let go of those reins. And so as more people came into the business, more engineers specifically, I still found myself at the center doing like code reviews or signing off on architecture docs. But ultimately, a large software organization can't scale with one person approving everything. Things have to move outside of them and around them without them ever getting their eyes on it. And so the two ways that I've solved it are, one, by building automation that essentially codifies Ishmael. Things like our continuous integration deployment system, our linting tools, and different libraries that I've written essentially prevent engineers from doing things that I don't want them to do, right? If they write bad code, if it's not formatted correctly, if it uses certain things, it slaps the things like, hey, you can't do that, and it gives an error that like I wrote. And so just automation is like the one big one. Two, bringing on like leadership and appointing, rather giving autonomy in how to run the teams to that leadership. So recently we went through an engineering reorganization where we split from a flat structure, where it's like me and then all the engineers, to me, then 4 teams where at each team was a product manager and a tech lead, and each of them have autonomy as to how they run their teams. And so I meet with them once a month, and we get aligned on what needs to happen within their team, and then they have full autonomy as to how those things get done, as long as they get done, right? And the teams that are getting those things done, I'm like, great, cool, nothing needs to be said. The teams that aren't getting those things done, I'll step in and be like, hey, what's going on here?
I have 3 questions. Do you want to ask them one at a time or all together?
Fire away.
Alright, so my first question is getting into IT. Talk a little bit about your experience and how you got in. Did you like it? Or is it? The second question was finding your first few customers, which are the hardest. And then I'm currently running an agency. So talking about your experience around the agency, why you left, what you like, what you don't.
Cool. Really good questions. I'll start in reverse order. For the agency, I love doing it because I got exposed to a lot of different problem sets and I got paid to learn. And I generally think that most people could benefit from working in a service business, just not having to focus on like the long-term scaling, scaling something to several zeros, instead focusing on how to make this thing work, right? Do things that don't scale. Like it teaches you how to do things really, really good. Why I didn't continue an agency is because agencies don't scale. And I wanted to build something like Planet Scale. Then how I found our first customers. Me and my co-founder both have pretty extensive tech networks. And so when we were doing customer development, we had like hundreds of interviews probably like 200 interviews that we lined up just of like founders and executives at different companies. And so by talking to them, we were able to learn a lot about what we shouldn't do and where we were wrong in our original thesis. And many of them became our first customers and beta users. So if you're a founder, a piece of advice, or you plan to be a founder, is like spend a lot of time investing in your network. Just go to events, talk to people, help people with their products, give as much free advice as possible. And then when it's time for you to like be up to bat, like people will line up around you and help out. Then the first question was YC. How was the experience getting into it? So YC invests in founders, like not products. I think they also knew in our interview that we were going to pivot. And when we did pivot, they were like, okay. And so there are things that they're looking for. They're primarily looking for your mental model. So as you're talking about like your product, they want to understand how you arrived at this thing, right? They want to see if you've done any customer development, how many of them you've talked to, like where you think you'll go wrong, where the pitfalls are. And they want to see that you'll be able to navigate the many just turns of building a business. And so I'd say there's that. They also they want to know that you're the right person to build this solution. There's there's product market fit and there's founder market fit. Right? Are you 10 times better to work on this thing? Like, do you know it inside out? Do you have some type of insider experience that you learned while doing this thing? And going up against 10 or 50 or 100 other competitors, are you going to be are you going to be better? When we did our interviews, they saw that we had already interviewed like 100+ people. We had voiced our concerns about the graduation problem and the sales problems, and they're like, how are you going to solve those? We're like, oh, we don't know yet, but we recognize that they're problems, and they like that. And then us having been in software for so long and understanding some of these problems was a natural progression to work on dev tools to scale that.
So were you at the idea stage, or did you have a product in market already?
We're idea stage, yeah. No, that's another thing. Most of these accelerators, like people think you have to have X. Like we had no products, and we raised $1 million with no product, and we didn't even build that product. And so, like it's all about your vision and and are people willing to bet on you? I actually think it's much easier to raise money when you don't have a product. Once you have a product, people like investors will look at your stats and be like, oh, why don't you have 1 million users yet? And blah blah blah, right? Whereas when you have no product, you're like, we're gonna have 1 million users.
You said that at some point you and your co-founder realized that it wasn't a good use of your time to both be in all the same meetings.
Mm.
What point, like what scale were you at, and like kind of how did you come about realizing that was a problem, and that kind of you can make that change?
I think it was natural. That there wasn't like any formal conversation, right? I think at the beginning stages, it made sense for both of us to be at the customer development meetings, so we needed to both understand and agree what we were building and what we were not going to build. And then naturally, after those meetings, we would deviate where I would start like looking at software and like writing things, and then he would think about go-to-market and writing strategies around that, and then we would come back together once the engineering team started building. I was spending more time reviewing code, more time meeting with engineers, more time just like around product and engineering, and I didn't. It didn't make sense for him to be in that, and so I was like, let me just do this, and he was like, yeah, this isn't a good use of my time, and naturally as we were bringing on sales and blah blah, it wasn't a good use of my time. So I think it was just like a very natural progression. I think people shouldn't try and fight that. It's a huge waste of time if you just like have executives who are over each other's shoulders. You have to have that trust.
I've got a few questions as well. We're probably on the tech side. So one, what's like the major differentiator between like Paragon and something like a Zapier or like a Tray? Two, kind of like what's the tech stack that you guys are building and like how is it going to scale? And three, where do you guys see yourself in like 3+ years?
Totally. So we don't see Zapier as a competitor because Zapier is for internal workflows, right? As opposed to connecting to your customers' data, right? Like Zapier doesn't embed in your product, and it only is for, hey, when someone fills out my Google form, when someone clicks on like this ad, when someone does this on my account, then do this, right? As opposed to when my user does this, right? Do that when my user does this. So it's like a end problem, right? Tray is a competitor. Their original product was like a Zapier-like competitor, and we do compete against them. We actually beat them on most deals, and they've written a lot of copy comparing us and them. They've reached out to a number of our customers too, trying to get them to convert. But we're currently eating their lunch.
Awesome.
And then tech stack, we're full stack TypeScript. I'm a huge proponent of JavaScript. If you know JavaScript, you can work anywhere on our team. We do everything from our microservices to front end to even our DevOps in TypeScript. We have a monorepo, and the idea is that our engineers can see everything across that. Per general architecture, microservices, Kubernetes, primarily SQL, like Postgres. We have several instances of that. Heavy caching with like Redis because just hundreds of millions of like requests going, and we found like SQL can be a bottleneck when doing like inserts and updates. Primarily AWS, but we are currently the only on-premise provider in our entire industry, and so we offer on-premise for AWS, GCP, and Azure, and so we've become experts on the three of those. And if you're a customer who wants to run Paragon on any of those clouds, we support it.
Do you guys do GCC and like DoD stuff as well, since you guys have on-prem?
GCC. What's GCC?
Like high security, like confidential.
So we do some HIPAA stuff. There's like some medical companies. For a number, we've got customers in like Europe who they use us because of GDPR like related stuff, and so definitely a lot of things around that. I think there's some other like cases where we've got customers in like South America and Australia that are on premise, and for them it's primarily not compliance, but they just need the data and the servers living close to their users, so there's not this like crazy latency. And so for international customers, they'll also do on-prem because of just data location.
Yeah, I have a question here. I was just going to ask about, how did you go about getting your first institutional and non-institutional investors? Because it sounds like you've raised a couple times already.
Mhm.
How was that experience?
Yeah. So pre-seed and seed is very different from price rounds like Series A and like beyond. For pre-seed and seed, what we do is we start with the least sophisticated investors, and don't mean this as an insult, but rather just who's going to do the least amount of diligence, right? And we'd start with just like angels, right? People who are like, hey, I believe in you. Here's a check, right? And so for pre-seed, we did rolling cap where at the beginning we say, hey, it's the cap is $5 million. You have 1 week, and we offered some angels. We raised maybe $1,500,000 that way. Then we moved the next week to like hyper angels or super angels who invest like $50,000, $100,000 checks. We got a couple of those, and then from there we went to like micro funds, and those funds are like $2 million, $10 million funds, like pretty small, and they write between like $50,000 and $150,000 checks. Got a few of those, and then we went to like more institutional, but still early investors. So we got Village Global in there, and they did like I think 250, and so with like your initial fundraising, it's from who's like the smallest, gonna write the smallest checks, to who's like the most sophisticated. It's like the micro funds and all of them, like, hey, who else invested, right? Who already wrote you a check, and we want to show traction, right? And so we go based off of like how much traction we can get. Now for price rounds, it's the exact opposite, where you want a lead and the lead will set the terms. And so we don't talk to anyone until the lead's closed. And so we spent I don't know, maybe like 2 months or something just going through meetings, due diligence, etc. Finally closed the lead. Once the lead was closed, everything else closed like in a few days. Like once you have a lead in a Series A or B or C, everyone else will typically write the checks. Is that the lead writes disproportionately amount of money. So our lead put like 10 of the 13 million we raised.
So how was it, especially for those first people that you reached out to for the first couple of weeks? Was that only based on your network, or did you find ways to find those internal investors?
Based on our network, and so both me and my co-founder have very strong opinions on fundraising. And I apologize if there's any VCs or investors here, but I think most investors suck. Most of them don't know what they're doing. They're looking for other people, like signal, like, hey, like who else invested in what terms do they invest in? If like YC invested, oh, we'll definitely invest, and blah blah. Like they're not leaders. Like they're not. They can't make judgment calls like themselves. On top of that, they're always known for like dragging their feet, right? And they'll be like, oh, like we'll keep in touch, and we'll keep in touch. And me and my co-founder experienced this in our previous businesses, and so this time, like we went to war. We're like, all right, so we're aligned where we're not going to be nice, right? We're going to be very aggressive with terms. We're not going to give them very much time, and it's played out very well for us. So like what that means is to start, we reached out and we're like, hey, here's the cap. You have 1 week. If you don't write a check in this 1 week, you're not going to get a chance again. And we didn't give them a chance to ask who else put in, and we're just like, it doesn't matter, right? Either write a check or we're done. And so we had like the first week at a 5 million cap, and what we're doing there is playing on like the FOMO, like an investors biggest fears, like FOMO. Like they don't want to be the investor that missed out on like the Uber or like the Lyft or like the the next big thing. And so especially at like the best terms possible, right? And so if you give them the opportunity to invest whenever they want, then they're going to invest whenever they want, right? And so you have to say you're going to invest here like this under these terms, and if you don't do it here, you might get one more chance, but it's going to be at these terms. And so we reached out to a few angels who we thought could invest under like the right terms, and so we're like, you have until Friday. You're the first people to get this offer. It goes up to $6 million on Friday, and we raised a good amount of money on that. Then we did that to the next batch at $6 million, the next batch at 7, the next batch at 8, and we were able to close a good amount of money each week like that.
Do you handle, especially in the early days, when an investor says no or disagrees with your model? Because I know that's something a lot of entrepreneurs face adversity in, especially when they're first trying to get off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's two things here, right? Like the investor feedback, which the investor feedback and then the feedback, right? And so getting feedback, you should always like listen to it, right? And so like we're always incorporating that and like understanding if like our business like can't scale. But at the beginning, to be honest, like I'm surprised people gave us money, right? Because the idea wasn't fleshed out, right? But I think just given how aggressive we were with raising, and given our past to people, like, okay, well they'll figure it out. There's like a very vague pitch deck where it's like APIs, we're gonna figure it out. Give us your money. Then there's like investor feedback, and what I mean by that is one of our investors, it's one of the partners at YC. He personally invested Dalton. He says, believe the no, don't believe the why. And what that means is like when investors say no, like they're always going to make up like some excuse, right? Oh, like it's too early or blah, blah, or blah, blah. And like listen to it, but like most of the time it's us. It's like, yeah, like most of the no's that we got like honestly didn't mean anything. And so we just moved on.
Can you dive a little deeper into being aggressive?
Yeah. Once again, most investors suck. Really suck. Like they are looking for signals from like other people, right? Like they don't want to be the only person to get on the boat, and they don't want to be the last person on the boat, right? And so the best investors, they don't care who else invests, and they don't care like the terms, all that. Like they might ask like the terms just to make sure like they're not getting like the worst deal, but like generally the types of investors that you want to work with have strong conviction in like their own belief, and they can make judgment calls regardless, like in a complete void. And so those are additionally the people that we looked for first, because we knew we weren't going to get a lot of that. And we get people who cold reach out to us all the time who want to invest, but they're looking for like signals and things, and if they ask like certain questions, like we're just like, you're probably not the type of investor we want to work with. And so we say no to a lot of investors just because they're probably a lot of headache and aren't going to add any material benefit to us other than cash, which there's like an abundance of these days, at least within the private markets. So yeah, like when you're fundraising, like don't let investors set the pace. Like every founder who's raised money and everyone who's failed to raise money has stories of being pulled around for weeks or months, and it's like, oh, it's like keep in touch, and oh, like it's a little bit early, but I'm gonna touch base, so I'll circle back. I'm like, fuck all that. It's like give me your money or don't.
I love it. Last question we always ask, one of our core values is help first. So what can we do for you? So you as a founder, what can this community do to help you?
You need to help me. I think so. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what I want to accomplish over like the next 10 years, and how I want to impact the world in the next 10 years. And I am doubling, like quadrupling down on my skill sets as a CTO, as an engineer, and I want to expose myself to a lot of different problem sets. And so this is like a help me help you. And so I've been giving a lot of just like free advice, to friends who are working on engineering problems. Because it's also good for me to be exposed to those things. And so if you have interesting engineering problems or architecture problems or whatever it may be, I'd love to help you with those. I'm not charging for any of that. I refuse to take your money. But that's something that I'm focusing on to increase my engineering ability.
Incredible. Can we get a round of applause, please?